The year is 1346. Imagine, if you will, the tapestry of 14th century Europe, a patchwork of kingdoms and villages stitched together by winding roads and the slow, steady rhythm of peasant life. Fields of gold ripple under the summer sun, the scent of hay and wildflowers heavy in the air. Towns bustle with activity, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer a familiar soundtrack to daily life. Cathedrals rise like stone prayers against the sky, their stained glass windows catching the light, painting stories of saints and angels onto the dusty floors. Life, for many, was a simple existence. Days were filled with the labor of the fields, the tending of animals, the quiet companionship of family and neighbors. Evenings were spent around crackling fires, sharing stories and simple meals, the sounds of children's laughter mingling with the murmur of prayers. There was a beauty in this simplicity, a quiet strength in the community. Yet, even as the sun set on those golden fields, a shadow stretched across the horizon, unseen by most, yet growing steadily larger. Trade routes, the arteries of the medieval world, carried not only goods and spices, but also an unseen enemy. From the distant east, a chilling breath crept westward, borne on the winds. Ships laden with silks and spices also carried something far more deadly, something that would soon tear at the fabric of society, leaving a trail of grief and devastation in its wake. It began subtly, a cough here, a fever there, a sickness that left the strong weak and the vibrant pale. Whispers started in the shadowed corners of marketplaces, hushed conversations spoken between worried faces. Tales of a terrible plague, a death that swept through entire villages, leaving only silence in its wake. These whispers, at first dismissed as superstition, would soon become a terrifying reality. The coming storm was gathering strength, its dark clouds heavy with the promise of a devastation unlike anything the world had ever known. You might feel a slight chill now. This is merely the wind shifting. Nothing to be concerned about, just the gentle movement of the air. Rest easy and let the story lull you into sleep. Imagine, if you will, the vast, wind-swept plains of Central Asia, a land of nomadic tribes, their lives intertwined with the rhythm of the seasons and the slow, steady movement of their herds. Here, nestled amongst the towering mountains and whispering grasslands, the bubonic plague, a silent killer, lay dormant, a hidden threat within the teeming rodent populations. Fleas, tiny insects barely visible to the naked eye, carried the deadly bacteria, passing it unknowingly from one creature to another. For centuries, the plague remained largely contained, a regional concern. But the world, even then, was a web of interconnectedness. Caravans, laden with silks and spices, plodded along the ancient Silk Road, a network of trails stretching east and west, north and south. Merchants, travelers, and pilgrims moved along these routes, carrying not only their goods, but also, unwittingly, the seeds of a devastating pandemic. Picture a weary caravan, its members exhausted from weeks of travel under the relentless sun. They stop at a bustling oasis, a temporary respite before continuing their journey. Perhaps a rat, infected with the plague, scurries unnoticed amongst the supplies. A flea, clinging to its fur, jumps onto a merchant, its bite an almost imperceptible prick. The merchant, feeling only a slight itch, continues his travels, unaware that within his bloodstream a microscopic enemy has begun its insidious work. The plague, in its early stages, mimics other common ailments: fever, aches, and weakness. It's easily mistaken for a passing illness, a mere inconvenience. Yet, as days turn into weeks, the telltale signs begin to emerge. Swollen lymph nodes, known as buboes, giving the disease its infamous name. These swellings, sometimes the size of plums, are intensely painful, further debilitating the victim. The plague's insidious advance is slow, giving the disease time to spread. Slowly, insidiously, the plague crept along the trade routes. From Central Asia, it reached the Middle East, carried by the flow of people and goods. Small outbreaks, initially contained, were followed by larger, more widespread occurrences. The disease moved with the relentless pace of commerce and human migration, leaving behind a trail of suffering and death. It wasn't a dramatic explosion, but a quiet, deadly creep, the insidious advance of an unseen foe. And so, the stage was set for a tragedy that would alter the course of history. The year is 1346. Imagine, if you will, the bustling ports of Sicily, the vibrant markets of Constantinople, the quiet villages nestled along the Mediterranean. Life, in its own way, continued, but a shadow, unseen, unheard, was already creeping across the land. It arrived with the ships, silent and deadly, carried on the breath of sailors who themselves knew not the terror they bore. Messina, a city brimming with life, was among the first to feel its icy grip. At first, it was just illness. A fever, perhaps, a strange swelling of the lymph nodes, a cough that rasped in the chest. People fell ill. They recovered, or so it seemed. But the sickness returned, more ferocious this time. Dark, angry blotches bloomed upon the skin, the telltale signs of the buboes, a name that would soon become synonymous with death. The fear began subtly, a whisper in the marketplaces, a worried glance exchanged between neighbors. Then it became a shout. Families were decimated overnight. The strong fell as quickly as the weak. Doctors, baffled and helpless, offered remedies as useless as the prayers whispered to a deaf god. Their understanding of contagion was rudimentary at best. They bled patients, they applied leeches, they offered potions of dubious efficacy, but nothing worked. The disease, unseen, relentless, marched on. The confusion was immense. Was it a punishment from God? A curse? A poison? Rumors flew faster than the plague itself. Some blamed the Jews, others the stars, still others the foul air. No one understood its transmission, its insidious nature. The sick were abandoned, left to die in their homes or in the streets, their cries lost in the growing din of despair. The stench of death hung heavy in the air, a grim reminder of the invisible enemy that stalked them. The vibrant markets fell silent, the bustling ports grew eerily empty. Each passing day brought more despair, more death, more unanswered questions in the shadow of a terrifying and unknown enemy. Sleep now, and let the quiet of the night cradle you. The year is 1347. Imagine, if you will, the chill wind whispering through the narrow streets of a bustling European city. Life, for most, was a simple rhythm of work and worry, of sun-drenched days and starlit nights. But a shadow was lengthening, an unseen menace creeping closer with each passing breath. It began subtly, a small discomfort, a swollen gland, perhaps, nestled beneath the jawline or in the armpit. A dull ache, easily dismissed at first as a simple ailment, the fatigue of overwork or a chill caught in the damp air. But then the swelling would grow, not slowly, not gradually, but with a frightening urgency. The bubo, as it would come to be known, expanded, a hard, painful knot beneath the skin, throbbing with a feverish pulse. The skin around it, once smooth and healthy, now flushed a deep, angry red, then darkening to a bruised purple, the color of spilled wine in the twilight. This wasn't just a swelling. It felt like something was inside, something alive and malevolent, pushing against the flesh from within. Alongside this terrifying growth, a fever would seize its victim. Not a gentle warmth, but a raging inferno consuming the body from the inside out. Shivers would rack the frame, shaking the bones as if a mighty wind blew through the very marrow. The head would throb, each beat of the heart echoing in a dull, persistent pain behind the eyes. Delirium would follow, blurring the line between waking and sleeping, reality and nightmare. Vivid hallucinations would dance before the eyes, a grotesque masquerade of the sick mind. And then, the black. Dark patches would bloom upon the skin, tiny stars at first, spreading like shadows across the canvas of the body, turning the flesh mottled and bruised. Hemorrhages, tiny bursts of blood beneath the surface, painting the skin with a terrifying artistry. These were the signs of the plague's deadly advance, its relentless march through the body's systems. The speed of its progression was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of this unseen enemy. What began as a simple discomfort could, within days, consume the body entirely. A once vibrant individual, full of life and laughter, could be reduced to a fevered wreck, delirious and barely alive, in a matter of mere hours. The swiftness of its decline left little time for hope, little time for healing, only the desperate, chilling certainty of death's approach. And as the plague spread from person to person, it left a trail of devastation in its wake, a grim harvest sown across the land. Sleep now, and let the quiet stillness soothe your worries. As the plague's icy grip tightened, people turned to what they knew, to their faith, seeking solace and answers in a world consumed by death. Churches, usually bustling with life, became places of hushed prayer, filled with the flickering candlelight and the quiet sobs of the grieving. Priests, often themselves weakened by the sickness, offered mass and last rites, their voices a fragile thread against the overwhelming fear. Many believed the plague was God's punishment, a righteous wrath brought down upon a sinful world. This belief spurred a wave of intense religious devotion, with people pouring their hearts out in supplication, hoping to appease a seemingly angry God. But faith alone wasn't enough for some. Desperation bred a different kind of response, a visceral, almost frantic search for a way to cleanse the world and appease the divine. Flagellant movements, born from a deep sense of guilt and fear, swept through communities. Men and women, their bodies raw and bleeding, whipped themselves in public processions, believing that self-inflicted pain could atone for the sins of humanity and lift the curse of the plague. The rhythmic thud of whips against flesh became a haunting soundtrack to the era, a testament to the despair and the fervent hope that accompanied it. These processions, though born of piety, were also a poignant reflection of the helplessness that gripped people in the face of such an unstoppable force. Yet, alongside genuine remorse and spiritual yearning, a darker current flowed. In the face of such incomprehensible suffering, the search for someone to blame, for a scapegoat to carry the weight of the collective fear, became almost inevitable. Whispers turned to accusations. Fingers pointed at perceived outsiders. The Jews, often a convenient target for societal anxieties, faced persecution and violence, accused of poisoning wells and spreading the disease. Other marginalized groups also found themselves unjustly blamed, their already difficult lives made even more precarious by the unchecked accusations. These scapegoats became a horrifying reflection of society's inability to cope with the crisis. The blame shifted from the unseen enemy to a visible and vulnerable one. The desperate hunt for explanations turned a terrible tragedy into a horrific time of societal upheaval. It was a grim reminder that even in the darkest of times, humanity struggles with its own shadows. The quiet prayers, the frenzied flagellation, and the cruel scapegoating all stand as solemn monuments to the complex and often contradictory human responses to fear and faith in the shadow of death. As you drift off to sleep, let the gentle rhythm of these images lull you into peaceful slumber. Let the past remind you of resilience and of the importance of empathy and understanding. The plague. It wasn't a sudden storm, but a slow, creeping twilight. At first, perhaps you noticed a few more empty stalls in the market, a neighbor's cough lingering a little longer than usual. Then the whispers began, carried on the wind like fallen leaves. Whispers of sickness, of death, of families emptied and homes abandoned. The cheerful bustle of daily life, once a comforting rhythm, began to fade. The vibrant colors of the marketplace dulled, the sounds of bartering and laughter replaced by a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional, mournful toll of a distant bell. Shopkeepers, once eager to display their wares, began to close their doors, fearing the invisible enemy that stalked the streets. The scent of spices and fresh bread, once so invigorating, was slowly replaced by the acrid stench of decay, a constant reminder of the grim reality that crept closer with each passing day. Commerce, the very heartbeat of the city, faltered and then stopped. Trade routes fell silent, goods rotted in abandoned carts, and the flow of money, once a steady stream, dried up like a forgotten well. The rich, once insulated from the everyday struggles, found their gilded cages no longer safe havens. Their wealth could not buy immunity. The plague cared little for social standing. The societal structures, built upon generations of tradition and law, began to crumble. Governments, once strong and capable, struggled to maintain order amidst the chaos. The usual routines of life, marriages, births, funerals, were all conducted with a subdued solemnity, a heavy awareness of the fragile nature of existence. The very fabric of society unraveled, thread by thread, as fear and despair took hold. Families were torn apart, parents losing children, siblings separated by sickness and death. The strong bonds of community, previously a source of support, were stretched thin, as neighbors feared to even approach each other lest they contract the insidious disease.
Even religious faith, a cornerstone of so many lives, offered little solace. The plague seemed to mock the pleas of the devout, its relentless march indifferent to prayer. The world you knew, the world of order and routine, was fading, replaced by a haunting sense of uncertainty and loss. And in that fading light, you waited, hoping for the dawn.
Now, as the shadows lengthen and a gentle drowsiness settles upon you, let's consider the grim reality that accompanied the Black Death. Imagine Europe, a tapestry woven with vibrant life, suddenly unraveling thread by thread. The plague, a relentless thief in the night, stole lives with terrifying speed. We speak not of a few here and there, but of entire villages, towns, even cities silenced by its icy grip. Mortality rates during the Black Death's peak were staggering. Historians estimate that perhaps a third, maybe even half, of Europe's population perished. Think of that, 1 out of every 2 or even 3 people you knew, gone. Families were shattered, homes stood empty, fields lay fallow, their harvests left to rot. The air itself seemed to carry the weight of loss, a heavy blanket of grief draped across the continent. The demographic landscape of Europe was permanently altered. The young and old, the rich and the poor, none were spared the plague's relentless advance. Entire generations were wiped out, leaving behind a landscape of orphans and widows, their lives irrevocably changed. The vibrant, bustling markets and towns, once teeming with activity, became eerily quiet, the echoes of laughter replaced by the rasping coughs of the dying. Imagine the streets, once paved with the hurried footsteps of merchants and tradesmen, now hushed and desolate, marked only by the slow, solemn processions bearing the dead to hastily dug mass graves. The vibrant colors of life were muted, replaced by the drab hues of mourning. A chilling silence hung in the air, punctuated only by the occasional mournful cry or the rhythmic clang of the death knell. The social fabric frayed under the strain. Labor shortages were widespread, creating upheaval in the established social order. Those who survived found themselves facing a changed world, a world scarred by loss and uncertainty. The demographic shift triggered by the Black Death played a significant role in reshaping European society, its effects rippling through generations. The weight of this immense loss, this devastating harvest of the Grim Reaper, reverberates even now, centuries later. Let its somber tale lull you into a peaceful sleep, a reminder of the fragility of life and the strength of the human spirit to endure even the darkest of times. Breathe deeply now, and let the gentle rhythm of my voice carry you away to a restful slumber. Imagine yourself stepping into a hushed, dimly lit medieval chapel. The air is cool, carrying the faint scent of incense and old stone. On the walls and scattered across the aged wooden altar are paintings and sculptures. These aren't joyous celebrations of life, not in this time. No, these are reflections of the Black Death, a terrible shadow that fell across Europe. You see figures, thin and gaunt, their skin stretched taut over bone. Their eyes are hollow, their expressions etched with suffering. These are not idealized representations of death. These are portraits of agony, painstakingly rendered to capture the reality of the plague's ravages. Notice the detail, the swollen limbs, the pustules blooming on the skin, the chilling pallor of death settling over their faces. The artists weren't shying away from the grim truth. They were bearing witness, preserving a record of the suffering their communities endured. The skeletal figure of Death himself appears often. Sometimes he's a dancing macabre skeleton, a grinning reminder of mortality's inevitability. Other times he's a more somber figure, clad in shrouds, leading the afflicted towards their graves. He doesn't judge, he simply is. He's a constant presence, a stark reminder of the fragility of life. But amidst the scenes of decay and despair, there are hints of something else. Perhaps a small, flickering candle flame in a darkened room, symbolizing faith and hope even in the face of unimaginable loss. Or perhaps a quiet prayer scene, individuals seeking solace and comfort in their religious beliefs. These tiny glimmers of hope are subtle, almost hidden, yet they provide a counterpoint to the pervasive imagery of suffering and death. Consider the meticulous detail with which the artists depicted the physical effects of the plague. The rigor mortis, the bloating of the body, the signs of decomposition. It's a stark realism, a brutal honesty that stands in stark contrast to the idealized images of the human form often found in earlier art. This wasn't about beauty, it was about truth. These were the stories they needed to tell, the pain they needed to share. These works of art weren't just decorations. They were expressions of grief, prayers for salvation, and attempts to come to terms with the incomprehensible scale of the devastation. They are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to find hope and beauty even in the most desolate circumstances, even in the face of death itself. As you drift off to sleep, think about the stories those silent images whisper, carrying the echoes of a time long past. Let their quiet message of mortality and remembrance lull you into a peaceful slumber. The Black Death's shadow stretched far beyond the immediate toll of death. Its chilling grip on Europe lingered, reshaping the very fabric of society, particularly its economic landscape. Imagine, if you will, the fields, once tilled by countless hands, now lying fallow. The villages, once bustling with activity, now eerily quiet. The plague hadn't just taken lives, it had profoundly altered the relationship between labor and land. Before the pestilence, a vast majority of the population worked the land as serfs, bound to their lords by rigid, ancient customs. They owed labor and a portion of their harvest in exchange for protection and a small plot of land. But the plague drastically thinned the ranks of the peasantry. Suddenly, the remaining workers held a bargaining position they had never possessed before. Their labor became a precious commodity, and they were able to demand better wages and more favorable conditions. The old feudal system, so deeply ingrained, began to crack under the weight of this new reality. Landowners, desperate for workers to maintain their estates, found themselves in a weakened position. They had to offer more to entice laborers, offering not just higher wages, but also greater freedoms. The strict rules that had governed the lives of serfs for centuries started to erode, slowly but surely. Some landowners even offered land ownership opportunities in exchange for dedicated labor, ushering in a period of gradual economic and social mobility that would change the face of rural Europe. The change wasn't uniform across the continent. In some regions, the shift was gradual, a slow unraveling of the old order.
In others, the transition was more abrupt, marked by widespread unrest and social upheaval as workers and landowners clashed over the new balance of power. Yet the overall trend was clear. The plague's devastation had unwittingly empowered the working class, fundamentally altering the power dynamic that had defined European life for centuries. The towns and cities, too, felt the economic aftershocks. The demand for skilled labor in crafts and trades soared as populations, albeit smaller, rebuilt and re-established their lives. This, in turn, contributed to the growth of towns and cities, further undermining the dominance of the rural feudal system. The plague, in its grim and terrible way, had inadvertently sown the seeds of a more dynamic economy, one less rigidly controlled by the landed gentry. The long, slow process of economic recovery was marked by uncertainty and struggle, but it was also a period of profound transformation, a reshaping of society that reverberated through the centuries. Let these thoughts drift with you now as you gently fall asleep.
The Black Death's shadow stretched far beyond the immediate toll of death. As the plague receded, leaving behind empty villages and shattered families, a slow but profound shift began to ripple through the fabric of medieval society. Imagine the fields, once tilled by countless hands, now lying fallow, the rhythm of rural life broken. The scarcity of laborers, a consequence of such devastating loss, gave those who survived a newfound leverage. Serfs, once bound to their lords' lands, found their bargaining power unexpectedly strengthened. The old system, with its rigid hierarchies, began to crack under the weight of this new reality. Peasants, emboldened by their scarcity, dared to demand better conditions, better wages, a fairer share of the harvest. In some places, these demands were met with negotiation, a grudging acceptance of change. In others, the response was harsher, met with resistance from those clinging to the old ways. Yet the tide was turning. The revolts that followed, though often brutally suppressed, represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power. The unquestioning obedience of centuries was fraying at the edges. The decline of feudalism wasn't a sudden collapse, but a slow unraveling. The power of the landed aristocracy, once absolute, was weakened. The economic upheaval caused by the plague made it difficult for lords to maintain their vast estates and their lavish lifestyles. The system that had relied on a rigid hierarchy of lord and serf became less sustainable. Slowly, new structures began to emerge from the ashes of the old. Towns and cities, already growing in importance before the plague, now flourished. The demand for skilled labor, for artisans and merchants, increased, leading to the rise of a powerful merchant class. These were people who accumulated wealth not through land ownership, but through trade and commerce. They began to exert their influence on the political landscape, challenging the long-held dominance of the nobility. Their growing power shifted the economic and political center of gravity, subtly reshaping the very foundations of medieval life. The familiar world, once defined by rigid social structures and a feudal system, slowly and peacefully gave way to a new era, uncertain yet full of the quiet promise of change. The whispers of this transformation, carried on the wind, settled into the quiet spaces of the sleeping world. The Black Death, a shadow that fell across the world, leaving millions lost to its chilling grip. As the plague swept through villages and cities, leaving a trail of sorrow and fear, people searched for answers, for solace, for a way to understand the incomprehensible suffering. Religion, naturally, offered a framework for many to grapple with the devastation. Prayers intensified, churches overflowed with the desperate seeking divine protection. But amidst the pleas for mercy, a more visceral response emerged: the Flagellant movement. Picture this: processions winding through streets, a river of grief and penitence. Men and women, their faces etched with anguish, their bodies clad in rough-spun cloth. Each step, a measured beat against the cobblestones, each movement a testament to their sorrow. These were the Flagellants, participants in a fervent religious movement born from the desperate hope to appease God's wrath. They believed the plague was a punishment for humanity's sins, a divine retribution for wickedness ignored. And so they sought atonement through self-flagellation. Imagine the rhythmic thud of whips against skin, the cries of pain mingling with chanted prayers. These weren't displays of madness or cruelty in their minds. Rather, they were acts of profound piety, a physical manifestation of their spiritual suffering. The blood shed was seen as a substitute for the blood shed by Christ, a mirroring of his sacrifice. Their public displays of penance were a desperate attempt to appease God, to cleanse the world, and to, perhaps, just perhaps, halt the relentless march of the plague. The Flagellant movement spread rapidly, fueled by the fear and desperation that gripped the populace. Processions grew larger, the fervor more intense. However, not everyone welcomed the movement. Church authorities, already struggling to manage the chaos, found themselves grappling with the implications of these self-inflicted acts of penance. Some saw the Flagellants as sincere, if misguided, penitents. Others viewed them with suspicion, their uncontrolled fervor and uncontrolled practices seeming dangerously out of hand. Some even feared that the Flagellants' actions might be inciting further unrest, adding to the already overwhelming societal disruption. The Flagellant movement, though intense and ultimately short-lived, became a powerful symbol of the era. It stands as a testament to the raw emotional response to the unthinkable trauma of the Black Death. A desperate attempt to find meaning, solace, and redemption amidst the pervasive darkness. As the echoes of their whips faded, the world continued to grapple with the aftermath of the plague, but the Flagellants left their mark, a poignant reminder of humanity's resilience and its attempts to make sense of the unimaginable. And now, let the gentle rhythm of my voice lull you into a peaceful sleep. Rest easy. The Black Death, a name that whispers on the wind, carrying with it the chill of fear and the weight of unimaginable loss. Imagine, if you will, the 14th century. Life was simpler in many ways, but also brutally precarious. And then the plague arrived, a relentless enemy, invisible yet devastating, sweeping across continents and leaving a trail of suffering in its wake. The people of the time, understandably, didn't understand what was happening. The knowledge we have today about bacteria and viruses, about the complex mechanisms of disease, was simply not available. They saw death on a scale never before witnessed, and their explanations reflected the limited understanding of the world around them. Some believed it was divine punishment, a wrath unleashed upon a sinful humanity. Others pointed to imbalances in the humors, those vital fluids believed to govern the body's health. An excess of black bile, perhaps, or a deficiency in blood. These were the explanations offered, and these were the targets of treatment. Treatments, it must said, were often as ineffective as they were bizarre. The stench of death hung heavy in the air, yet the prevailing belief was that noxious smells caused the disease. So strong perfumes, fragrant herbs, and even burning spices were employed, a futile attempt to mask the odor and, it was hoped, the disease itself. People carried posies of flowers and herbs to their noses, believing the sweet scent would ward off the pestilence. Bloodletting was another common practice. The theory was that by removing bad blood, one could restore balance and rid the body of the infection. Imagine the scene: a weakened, already feverish person, further drained of their vital fluids. It was a cruel, often fatal intervention. Other remedies involved applying leeches, believing these creatures could somehow suck out the disease. The poor souls afflicted were subjected to these treatments, hoping for a cure that never came. And then there were the more esoteric approaches. Some believed that the plague was a punishment from God, brought on by the sins of mankind. Penance, prayer, and religious processions became widespread, a desperate attempt to appease divine anger. Many sought solace and perhaps a measure of control in the rituals of their faith. Yet even faith couldn't stop the relentless advance of the plague. It swept through villages, towns, and cities, leaving a path of devastation that would forever alter the course of history. Now let the gentle rhythm of my voice carry you away into a peaceful slumber. Rest now. You are safe. The Black Death. Its immediate horror fades into the past, but its shadow stretches long, altering the very fabric of European life. Imagine, if you will, the quiet villages, once bustling with activity, now hushed with a different kind of sorrow. The plague took not only lives, but also the familiar rhythm of daily existence. Entire families were wiped out, leaving behind empty houses and fields that went unplanted. The land, once carefully tilled, lay fallow for a time. The scarcity of workers led to a gradual shift in power. Those who survived, the laborers and farmers, found themselves in a position of unexpected strength. The demand for their skills was high, pushing wages upwards, a slow but steady revolution in the feudal system. The rigid hierarchy, once so firmly entrenched, began to crumble under the weight of changed circumstances. Think of the cathedrals, rising majestic and silent against the twilight sky. The plague fostered a deep sense of religious uncertainty. Why had God allowed such devastation? Some sought solace in fervent piety, building more grand structures to appease the divine. Others questioned the very foundations of their faith, their belief shaken to its core. Art and literature, too, reflected this profound shift in perspective. The paintings and stories that emerged often carried a note of melancholy, a quiet acknowledgement of mortality and the fragility of life. The universities, places of learning and scholarship, were also profoundly affected. Many scholars perished, taking with them invaluable knowledge. The disruption to education was considerable, but slowly new methods and new ideas emerged from the ashes. The plague, in its horrific way, inadvertently spurred innovation, forcing societies to adapt and to find new ways of organizing themselves, working together to rebuild a shattered world.
Across the continent, the plague's mark is visible in the changed demographics, in the altered social structures, and in the very architecture of cities. Even now, centuries later, as you drift off to sleep, consider the subtle ways in which this devastating event continues to shape our world. It's a reminder of our shared vulnerability, a testament to resilience, and a quiet reflection on the enduring impact of historical events. The long shadow of the Black Death continues to fall, reminding us of the past and quietly influencing our present.
The plague's grip finally loosened, its icy fingers slowly releasing their hold on Europe. But the continent it left behind was scarred, a landscape etched with the grief of countless lost lives. Empty villages dotted the countryside, their silent streets a testament to the devastation. Fields lay fallow, untended, the rhythm of agricultural life broken. The air, once thick with the cries of the sick, now held a quieter, heavier stillness. Slowly, painstakingly, life began to re-emerge. Survivors, those who had witnessed unimaginable horrors, started to rebuild. They cleared the debris from abandoned homes, their movements slow but determined. The work was backbreaking, the sun beating down on their weary bodies. Yet there was a purpose to their actions, a quiet hope clinging to their hearts. Families, often diminished in number, tentatively gathered, finding solace in shared memories and the quiet strength born of survival. They began to cultivate the land once more, planting seeds in the earth, a symbolic act of renewal. The harvest, though meager at first, represented a fragile victory, a step towards normalcy. Towns and cities, once bustling centers of trade and commerce, were now ghost towns. Slowly, however, people returned, drawn by the promise of a new beginning. But this was no immediate resurgence. The rebuilding was gradual, a slow, careful piecing together of shattered lives and communities. Craftsmen, often the few who had managed to avoid the worst of the disease, set about repairing damaged buildings, their hands skillfully mending the fabric of the ravaged society. The economic recovery was even slower. The loss of so much manpower had thrown the economic systems of Europe into disarray. Trade routes lay dormant, markets empty. Yet the human spirit, resilient and tenacious, persisted. New opportunities emerged as shortages fueled innovation and creativity. The survivors, having endured so much, faced the future with a newfound appreciation for life and a cautious optimism for the years to come. The shadow of the plague remained, a dark memory haunting their days, but the seeds of hope had been planted, slowly taking root in the fertile ground of a world slowly coming back to life. The healing was slow, but it was certain. The rebuilding of Europe, after the immense tragedy of the Black Death, had begun. The wind whispers secrets through the leaves, a gentle rustling like pages turning in an ancient book. And tonight, that book tells the story of the Black Death, a shadow that once fell across the world. Imagine, if you will, the crowded streets of 14th century Europe, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke, and something else, something unsettling. The plague crept in silently, at first just a few, then many, felled by a relentless fever. The world back then didn't understand the tiny, unseen enemy causing such devastation. There were no microscopes, no germ theory. Fear reigned, and with it, misinformation. Some blamed the Jews, others the stars, still others the wrath of God. Quarantine, in its most basic form, was attempted, isolating the sick, but the understanding of contagion was so limited that even these measures were often ineffective. The death toll was unimaginable, leaving villages emptied and cities decimated. But even in darkness, small lights flickered. While the understanding of the disease's cause was absent, some practical steps were taken. Observant individuals noted that those who cared for the sick often fell ill themselves, hinting at the mode of transmission, though they lacked the scientific tools to define it. The practice of quarantine, imperfect as it was, demonstrated the importance of isolating the infected to prevent wider spread. These were nascent steps, clumsy perhaps in their execution, but vital in the face of overwhelming adversity. Centuries later, as we face new pandemics, we can draw valuable lessons from this dark chapter in history. The Black Death, in its brutal efficiency, highlighted the vulnerability of humanity in the face of infectious disease. It underlined the crucial need for accurate information, for clear and consistent communication, and the vital role of public health measures. We have a vastly improved understanding of pathogens and disease transmission today, yet the underlying principles remain the same. The effectiveness of quarantine, properly implemented and understood, hasn't changed. And the insidious nature of misinformation, then fueled by superstition, now by social media, remains a significant obstacle in our fight against infectious disease. So, as you drift off to sleep, remember the whispers of the past. Remember the lessons learned, both hard and precious, from the struggles of those who lived through the Black Death. May those lessons guide us forward, ensuring a kinder, healthier future for all. The wind continues its song, a lullaby for weary souls, a promise of peace and understanding in the quiet of the night. Sleep well. The wind whispers through the long grass, a soft sigh against the setting sun. Imagine, if you will, the fields of Europe, centuries past. Not the vibrant green of spring, but a muted, dusty brown, the color of dried earth and fading hope. The Black Death had fallen upon the land, a shadow clinging to every village, every town, every heart. Think of the faces you might have seen there, etched with worry, etched with grief. A mother clutching her feverish child, her eyes mirroring a fear that gnawed at her soul. A father, his strength broken, burying his wife under the hastily dug earth of a mass grave. The young lovers, separated by fate, their whispered promises cut short by the chilling cough that marked the grim reaper's approach. Picture the bustling marketplaces, once vibrant with life and laughter, now eerily silent. Stalls lay empty, their wares untouched, forgotten under a veil of dust. The sounds of commerce, the cheerful haggling, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer, all replaced by an unnerving quiet, broken only by the occasional mournful wail. Homes, once filled with the warmth of family, became empty shells, the chilling silence a testament to a life cruelly snatched away. The churches, usually overflowing with worshippers, became places of sorrow, filled with the scent of incense and the quiet prayers of the bereaved. Priests, their faces weary with the weight of their duties, offered last rites, their voices trembling with grief and exhaustion. Coffins, simple and hastily made, were carried through the streets, a constant reminder of the devastating toll.
Remember the countless stories left untold, the lives cut short before their time, the artist who never finished their masterpiece, the scholar who never shared their wisdom, the child who never knew the joy of growing old. Each individual, a universe of hopes, dreams, and loves, extinguished too soon. Their absence left a hole in the fabric of society, a void that echoed through the generations. The echoes of their lost laughter, their whispered secrets, their quiet breaths, fade only slowly, like the scent of the wildflowers that bloom in the meadows above their forgotten graves. Let their memory rest peacefully in your heart, a quiet acknowledgement of the immense human cost of a world grappling with loss. Let it serve as a reminder of the preciousness of each life, of the strength of the human spirit, and the enduring power of remembrance.
And so, as the last embers of the day fade into the twilight, we too draw closer to the quiet embrace of sleep. The stories we've shared tonight, whispers from history's vast library, have carried us on a gentle current, a peaceful journey through time. Imagine yourself now, nestled comfortably in your bed, the soft weight of your blankets, a comforting presence. The rhythmic ticking of a faraway clock, a soft, steady beat, mirrors the gentle rhythm of your own breath, slow and deep. Each inhale, a breath of peace. Each exhale, a release of the day's worries. Let them drift away, like dandelion seeds carried on a summer breeze, far beyond your reach, lost to the gentle night. Feel the tension melting from your shoulders, your neck, your jaw. Let your muscles relax, surrendering to the comforting weight of stillness. The world outside grows quieter, the sounds of the day fading into a hushed murmur, a distant lullaby. Focus on the gentle rise and fall of your chest, the steady pulse at your wrist, the soft touch of the sheets against your skin. Perhaps you see soft swirling colors in the darkness behind your eyelids, hues of lavender and twilight blue, merging and shifting gently like the tides on a calm, moonlit shore. Allow yourself to be carried away by these tranquil images, letting them soothe your mind and ease your body into slumber. The stories of kings and queens, of inventors and explorers, of ordinary people living extraordinary lives, they are now fading into the background, their echoes softly blending with the quiet whisper of the night. Their tales have served their purpose, to guide you gently towards this moment of peaceful rest. There are no more grand adventures to be had tonight, no more challenges to overcome. Just the gentle embrace of sleep, waiting patiently to envelop you in its soft, comforting arms. Let your thoughts drift lazily, like clouds across a vast, endless sky. Don't chase them, don't grasp at them, simply let them float by, carried on the currents of your breathing. Feel the warmth spreading through you, a gentle wave of relaxation washing over your entire being. Your mind slows, your body stills, your spirit settles into a deep and restful peace. Sleep now, knowing that you are safe, you are loved, and you are surrounded by the quiet beauty of the night. Drift away into the peaceful slumber that awaits. Good night.